50 Essays by George Orwell. Books versus Cigarettes, 1946. A couple of years ago a friend of mine, a newspaper editor, was fire-watching with some factory workers. They fell to talking about his newspaper, which most of them read and approved of, but when he asked them what they thought of the literary section, the answer he got was, "You don't suppose we read that stuff, do you? Why, half the time you're talking about books that cost 12 and sixpence. Chaps like us couldn't spend 12 and sixpence on a book." These, he said, were men who thought nothing of spending several pounds on a day trip to Blackpool. This idea that the buying, or even the reading, of books is an expensive hobby and beyond the reach of the average person is so widespread that it deserves some detailed examination. Exactly what reading costs, reckoned in terms of pence per hour, is difficult to estimate, but I have made a start by inventorying my own books and adding up their total price. After allowing for various other expenses, I can make a fairly good guess at my expenditure over the last 15 years. The books that I have counted and priced are the ones I have here, in my flat. I have about an equal number stored in another place, so that I shall double the final figure in order to arrive at the complete amount. I have not counted oddments such as proof copies, defaced volumes, cheap paper-covered editions, pamphlets, or magazines, unless bound up into book form. Nor have I counted the kind of junky books, old-school textbooks and so forth, that accumulate in the bottoms of cupboards. I have counted only those books which I have acquired voluntarily, or else would have acquired voluntarily, and which I intend to keep. In this category I find that I have 442 books, acquired in the following ways. Bought, mostly second-hand, 251. Given to me or bought with book tokens 33. Review copies and complimentary copies 143. Borrowed and not returned 10. Temporarily on loan 5. Total 442. Now as to the method of pricing. Those books that I have bought I have listed at their full price, as closely as I can determine it. I have also listed at their full price the books that have been given to me, and those that I have temporarily borrowed and kept. This is because book giving, book borrowing and book stealing more or less even out. I possess books that do not strictly speaking belong to me, but many other people also have books of mine, so that the books I have not paid for can be taken as balancing others which I have paid for but no longer possess. On the other hand I have listed the review and complimentary copies at half price. That is about what I would have paid for them second-hand, and they are mostly books that I would only have bought second-hand, if at all. For the prices I have sometimes had to rely on guesswork, but my figures will not be far out. The costs were as follows. £S. D. Bought 36.90. Gifts 10.10. Review copies, etc. 25.11.9. Borrowed and not returned for 16.9. On loan 3.10. Shelves 2.00. Total 82.17.6. Adding the other batch of books that I have elsewhere, it seems that I possess altogether nearly 900 books, at a cost of £165.15. This is the accumulation of about 15 years, actually more, since some of these books date from my childhood, but call it 15 years. This works out at £11 a year, but there are other charges that must be added in order to estimate my full reading expenses. The biggest will be for newspapers and periodicals, and for this I think £8 a year would be a reasonable figure. £8 a year covers the cost of 2 daily papers, 1 evening paper, 2 Sunday papers, 1 weekly review and 1 or 2 monthly magazines. This brings the figure up to £19 but to arrive at the grand total one has to make a guess. Obviously one often spends money on books without afterwards having anything to show for it. There are library subscriptions, and there are also the books, chiefly Penguins, and other cheap editions, which one buys and then loses or throws away. However, on the basis of my other figures, it looks as though £6 a year would be quite enough to add for expenditure of this kind. So my total reading expenses over the past 15 years have been in the neighborhood of £25 a year. £25 a year sounds quite a lot until you begin to measure it against other kinds of expenditure. It is nearly £9d a week, and at present £9d is the equivalent of about 83 cigarettes. Players even before the war it would have bought you less than 200 cigarettes. With prices as they now are, I am spending far more on tobacco than I do on books. I smoke 6 ounces a week, at £0.50 an ounce, making nearly £40 a year. Even before the war, when the same tobacco cost 8d an ounce, I was spending over £10 a year on it, and if I also averaged a pint of beer a day, at sixpence, these two items together will have cost me close on £20 a year. This was probably not much above the national average. In 1938 the people of this country spent nearly £10 per head per annum on alcohol and tobacco. However, 20% of the population were children under 15 and another 40% were women, so that the average smoker and drinker must have been spending much more than £10. In 1944, the annual expenditure per head on these items was no less than £23. Allow for the women and children as before, and £40 is a reasonable individual figure. £40 a year would just about pay for a packet of Woodbines every day and half a pint of mild 6 days a week, not a magnificent allowance. Of course, all prices are now inflated, including the price of books. Still, it looks as though the cost of reading, even if you buy books instead of borrowing them and take in a fairly large number of periodicals, does not amount to more than the combined cost of smoking and drinking. It is difficult to establish any relationship between the price of books and the value one gets out of them. Books includes novels, poetry, textbooks, works of reference, sociological treatises, and much else, and length and price do not correspond to one another, especially if one habitually buys books second-hand. You may spend 10 shillings on a poem of 500 lines, and you may spend sixpence on a dictionary which you consult at odd moments over a period of 20 years. There are books that one reads over and over again, books that become part of the furniture of one's mind and alter one's whole attitude to life, books that one dips into but never reads through, books that one reads at a single sitting and forgets a week later, and the cost, in terms of money, may be the same in each case. But if one regards reading simply as a recreation, like going to the pictures, then it is possible to make a rough estimate of what it costs. If you read nothing but novels and light literature, and bought every book that you read, you would be spending allowing 8 shillings as the price of a book, and 4 hours as the time spent in reading it 2 shillings an hour. This is about what it costs to sit in one of the more expensive seats in the cinema. If you concentrated on more serious books, and still bought everything that you read, your expenses would be about the same. The books would cost more but they would take longer to read. In either case you would still possess the books after you had read them, and they would be saleable at about a third of their purchase price. If you bought only second-hand books, your reading expenses would, of course, be much less, perhaps sixpence an hour would be a fair estimate. And on the other hand, if you don't buy books, but merely borrow them from the lending library, reading costs you round about a halfpenny an hour. If you borrow them from the public library, it costs you next door to nothing. I have said enough to show that reading is one of the cheaper recreations, after listening to the radio probably the cheapest. Meanwhile, what is the actual amount that the British public spends on books? I cannot discover any figures, though no doubt they exist. But I do know that before the war this country was publishing annually about 15,000 books, which included reprints and school books. If as many as 10,000 copies of each book were sold, and even allowing for the school books, this is probably a high estimate. The average person was only buying, directly or indirectly, about 3 books a year. These 3 books taken together might cost £1, or probably less. These figures are guesswork, and I should be interested if someone would correct them for me. But if my estimate is anywhere near right, it is not a proud record for a country which is nearly 100% literate and where the ordinary man spends more on cigarettes than an Indian peasant has for his whole livelihood. And if our book consumption remains as low as it has been, at least let us admit that it is because reading is a less exciting pastime than going to the dogs, the pictures, or the pub, and not because books, whether bought or borrowed, are too expensive.